May 1942, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. Dawn spread pale light over the test range as Lieutenant Edward Uhl shouldered a rickety 5-foot steel tube and tried to steady his breath. Cradled in his hands was a machine the Army hadn't yet named, a cobbled-together launcher made from junkyard steel, a battered wooden rifle stock, and a hope that the whole thing wouldn't blow apart. It looked laughably crude, and yet it might become one of the most consequential infantry weapons of the war. Uhl was 24, fresh from Lehigh University with an engineering degree and top honors. For weeks, he'd been chasing a problem with deadly urgency. The shaped charge grenade they'd developed could gut 4 inches of hardened armor, enough to defeat any German tank rolling through Europe. The catch, it was heavy. No soldier could safely throw it far enough. The Army needed a delivery method that was quick to build, easy to use, and safe enough to let a foot soldier stand behind it. Standing nearby with a clipboard, binoculars raised, was Captain Leslie Skinner. A career officer and lifelong tinkerer with rockets, Skinner had recently been promoted for his work on this very project. At 42, he wore the mild impatience of a man who had long ago decided experimentation was the only way forward, even if his experiments occasionally charred the roof of a hospital, as one youthful rocket mishap had once done. Now, with a Mark V tank rolling into position 300 yards downrange, both men felt the weight of what might happen next. Around them, the generals watched with polite skepticism. Brigadier General Gladian Marcus Barnes, the Army Ordnance Chief of Research and Development, had come more to humor a trial than to witness a revelation. Headquarters had been dismissive of Skinner's work, calling it a fanciful toy rocket. Yet the Allies' armored shortfalls were painfully clear. American infantry had little that could reliably stop mechanized assaults, and desperate tactics like training soldiers to run up and affix magnetic mines to tanks were costing lives. The launcher in Uhl's hands was a study in necessity. A plain tube, open at both ends, with crude sights bent from wire and a firing system scrounged from spare parts. A thinned rocket with a shaped charge warhead fitted inside. A dry cell battery and a salvage trigger completed the firing circuit. Nothing about the device suggested military polish. Everything about it spoke to a hurried, ingenious practicality born of urgent need. Its story reached back decades. Robert Goddard's early rocket experiments after World War I had been shelved for 20 years in dusty archives. With the fall of Poland and France, those old ideas suddenly mattered again. Solid-fuel rockets could propel warheads without dangerous recoil. The key challenge was warhead effectiveness and a launcher design simple enough for mass production. Engineers had refined the shaped charge grenade into the M10 by 1941, a warhead that could burn through armor like a torch, but it was too heavy to be hand-thrown and unsafe to mount on a rifle. Skinner had sketched launcher concepts in late 1940, but without a suitable warhead, his plans went nowhere. When the M10 surfaced in 1942, the pieces finally aligned. Skinner tasked Uhl, a recent recruit to the Special Projects Unit, with figuring out how to deliver the warhead safely and accurately. Uhl tried everything: deflectors to protect the firer from backblast, fins and stabilizers to keep rockets true, and simple sights for battlefield aiming. The breakthrough arrived not from a lab model, but from a scrap pile. While walking past the junk heap one afternoon, Uhl noticed a 5-foot steel tube whose diameter matched the M10 grenade almost perfectly. The idea was immediate and simple. Place the rocket in the tube, fire it from the shoulder, let the backblast vent harmlessly out the rear. No violent recoil, no flaming blast in his face. The propellant burned cleanly within the tube's length and vented rearward without injury. It worked. They refined it overnight. Proper sights, a sturdier trigger, and an electrical firing system that could withstand rough conditions. Dummy rounds proved safe. Now all that remained was to convince the brass. On the day of the Aberdeen demonstration, several established anti-tank systems were on trial. Cumbersome spigot mortars and crew-served launchers that used shaped charges but were slow to aim. The generals watched as crews fired at a moving Mark V. Despite multiple attempts, none of the mortars scored a hit on the tank as it rolled across the range. Accuracy that was acceptable against a stationary target failed in the face of motion. Then Skinner and Uhl stepped forward. Skinner hoisted the improvised tube to his shoulder, tracked the tank as it lumbered past, and squeezed the trigger. The first rocket screamed out and struck the hull with a metallic crash. A second shot found its mark. A third did too. Repeatedly, with nothing more than a humble tube, wire-bent sights, and rounds built for testing, they hit a moving target, while the supposedly sophisticated mortars had not. General Barnes, who had seen a lifetime of weapons trials, stepped closer, curiosity overtaking skepticism. In that moment, an invention stitched together from scraps and stubbornness began to look like the simple solution infantry desperately needed: a shoulder-fired rocket launcher that could put shaped charge power into the hands of individual soldiers and change the face of ground combat.
This one was different. He turned to Skinner with a request that was really an order. "Let me try it." Skinner handed over the launcher, walking Barnes through the simple firing procedure. Aim, track the target, squeeze the trigger. Nothing complicated, no lengthy training required. Barnes settled the tube against his shoulder, squinted through the crude sights, and fired. Direct hit. The general's face split into a rare smile. He looked at the launcher, then at Skinner, then back at the weapon. The words that came out of his mouth would become Army legend. "It sure looks like Bob Burns's Bazooka." Bob Burns was one of America's most popular comedians in the 1930s and early 1940s. His trademark prop was a bizarre musical instrument of his own creation, a long tube that produced comical sounds when blown. He called it a bazooka. The name stuck to the musical instrument and, moments later, to the weapon that would terrify German tank crews across 3 continents. Barnes wasn't just making a joke. He was christening a weapon that would become synonymous with infantry anti-tank warfare for the next 3 decades. That very day, standing on the Aberdeen range with rocket smoke still hanging in the air, Barnes provided a favorable report that led to immediate orders for 5,000 launchers into production. Not 5,000 for testing, 5,000 for combat deployment. A few days later, at Camp Sims, D.C., General George C. Marshall witnessed a demonstration before high-ranking War and Navy officials, Allied government observers, and British and Russian military observers. Marshall immediately issued verbal orders for 5,000 launchers and 25,000 anti-tank rockets, plus 5,000 practice rockets. General Electric received the contract on May 20, 1942, with an impossible deadline: 30 days to deliver 5,000 launchers. The clock started immediately at GE's Bridgeport, Connecticut facilities. Engineers worked around the clock reverse engineering Skinner and Uhl's prototype. The design was straightforward, which made it ideal for mass production. Steel tube, wooden stock, basic trigger mechanism, simple battery-powered ignition. Nothing exotic, nothing that required specialized manufacturing, just competent metalwork and woodworking at scale. The official designation was Launcher Rocket 2.36-inch Anti-Tank M1. Nobody called it that. From the factory floor to the front lines, it was the Bazooka. General Electric delivered the order with 89 minutes to spare. 5,000 bazookas ready for deployment, manufactured in 1 month. The weapon received formal designation on June 14, 1942. E.G. Budd Company manufactured the initial 25,000 M6 anti-tank rockets and 5,000 M7 practice rockets. But having the launcher was only half the equation. The rocket itself, designated M6, proved troublesome. Early production rockets suffered from horrific reliability problems. Primers failed to ignite,
Fins bent during transport. Propellant charges burned inconsistently, too quickly in hot weather, risking tube burst, too slowly in cold weather, scorching the gunner's face. The shaped charge warhead worked perfectly in laboratory conditions, but proved temperamental in the field. The electrical ignition proved problematic in wet and cold climates. The contact ring system caused structural weakness in the rocket. When the M6 worked, it was devastating. When it didn't, it was useless. This would become painfully apparent in the weapon's combat debut. November 8, 1942. The beaches of North Africa. Over 100,000 American and British troops hit beaches at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers simultaneously. It was America's first major offensive operation of the war. Among the forces landing were units from the 1st Infantry Division at Oran, 1st Armored Division Combat Command B at Oran, and the 34th Infantry Division, some equipped with the new M1 bazookas. The night before the landings on November 7, 1942, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower was shocked to learn that none of his troops had received any training on the new weapon. Bazookas had been rushed to North Africa so quickly that many soldiers first saw them when crates were pried open on transport ships. No manuals, no instructors, no practice ammunition, just a tube and some rockets with vague assurances that it could stop tanks. The initial North African fighting was chaotic. French colonial forces loyal to Vichy resisted with unexpected ferocity. German troops rushed reinforcements to Tunisia. American forces untested in combat struggled with coordination, leadership, and equipment they barely understood. The bazooka saw little to no meaningful combat use during the torch landings themselves. The weapon that had performed brilliantly at Aberdeen was failing before it even reached the battlefield. The first documented combat use occurred during the Tunisia campaign that followed. The 168th Infantry Regiment of the 34th Infantry Division received their first shipment of bazookas on February 12, 1943, during the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Soldiers learned to use them against German armor attacks on February 14, 1943, under the worst possible circumstances. The bazooka's performance in the Tunisian fighting was dismal. The unreliable M6 rockets misfired constantly. Soldiers who had never trained with the weapon couldn't judge distances or leading angles for moving targets. The electrical firing system proved vulnerable to moisture and rough handling. Battery contact corroded in the salt air. Rocket propellant absorbed humidity, burning incompletely or not at all. After months of combat in Tunisia, Army ordnance officers compiled a disturbing assessment. An American general visiting the Tunisian front in 1943, after the close of combat operations, could not find any soldiers who could report that the weapon had actually stopped an enemy tank. Not a single verified tank kill could be attributed to the bazooka. Soldiers reported firing at enemy armor only to watch rockets bounce off, fail to detonate, or miss entirely. In May 1943, the Army suspended further deployment of the M1 bazooka. The entire program seemed on the verge of cancellation. Millions of dollars invested in a weapon that couldn't accomplish its primary mission. But Skinner, O'Neill, and the ordnance engineers at Aberdeen refused to give up. They began methodically addressing each failure point. The rocket was redesigned as the M6A1 with a new contact system using wire unspooled from the rear, replacing the nose contact ring that had created structural weakness. Propellant sticks were shortened, reducing peak pressures. The fuse and electrical ignition were improved. The launcher became the M1A1 with a simplified design that eliminated the forward hand grip, added a face guard at the hand position, included a conical muzzle deflector and carrying strap, revised the safety mechanism, and reduced weight from 18 pounds to just 12 3/4. The simplified sighting device had
They understood the bazooka's capabilities and limitations. They had practiced hitting moving targets. They were ready. Gavin later wrote in American Heritage magazine that the bazookas were most important since they were the only weapons the troopers were carrying that would enable them to engage the German armor on reasonable terms. The 82nd drop was a disaster. High winds scattered paratroopers across 50 miles of Sicilian countryside. Gavin landed far from his intended drop zone, gathering a handful of men and moving toward the sound of fighting. By dawn on July 11, 1943, scattered groups of American paratroopers found themselves defending a ridgeline called Bazooka Ridge against elements of the German German Panzer Division. Tiger VI tanks from a company of the 215th Tank Battalion, along with Panzer IV medium tanks, approximately 700 infantry, and one armored artillery battalion advanced toward the American positions. The paratroopers were outnumbered, outgunned, and scattered, but they had bazookas. The first American soldiers to engage the German armor fired their bazookas at Tiger tank frontal armor. The rocket struck with tremendous impact, then bounced off harmlessly. The shaped charge warheads couldn't penetrate the Tiger's thick frontal plates. This was a known limitation, but in the chaos of combat, with 60-ton monsters bearing down on their positions, some soldiers panicked. Gavin later wrote that their bazooka rounds simply bounced off the armor plating of the big 60-ton Tigers, which replied with 88mm cannon fire. He noted that many bazooka teams had had pieces of bazookas ground up in them by tanks as they were crushed during the vulnerable loading and firing sequences. But seasoned NCOs kept their heads. They had been trained to target weak spots, side armor, rear engine compartments, tank tracks. As Tigers maneuvered to bring their 88mm main guns to bear, American bazooka teams shifted position, seeking angle shots. Through the long, brutal day at Bazooka Ridge, the battle raged. Naval gunfire from USS destroyers with 155mm guns proved decisive, along with the arrival of Sherman tanks. Lieutenant Harold H. Swingler, commander of Service Company 505 PIR, and a former intercollegiate boxing champion, arrived approximately 1,900 hours with Sherman tanks and approximately 50 men from Regimental Headquarter Company. He captured the first Tiger tank intact by killing the crew with a hand grenade when they were outside the vehicle. Swingler was later killed in action on D-Day, June 6, 1944. By evening, the German attack had stalled. The Hermann Göring Division withdrew, having suffered losses. At least one Tiger was captured intact, and Germans withdrew, leaving equipment behind. For the broader Sicily campaign that continued through August 17, 1943, M1A1 bazookas are credited with destroying 4 medium German tanks and 1 Tiger I. The Tiger kill was described in military histories as achieved through an improbable hit, reportedly through the driver's vision slot, though specific details of this engagement, including exact date, location, unit designation, or soldier names, have not been documented in available sources. Gavin's after-action report praised the bazooka's effectiveness when properly employed.